What happens when Hollywood's most beloved everyman faces one of television's sharpest interviewers under the glaring lights of live television? If you thought Chris Pratt's previous interviews were all laughs and charm, you haven't seen him tested by George Stephanopoulos until now. Because what started as a cheerful morning chat would soon turn into something far more confrontational, leaving millions of viewers stunned and wondering if they'd ever truly known the man behind the smile. The morning sun poured through the towering glass windows of the Good Morning America studio in New York City. The set gleamed with its usual warmth, coffee mugs neatly placed, cameras humming softly, and a backdrop of Manhattan skyline glowing against a perfect blue sky. Producers, dressed in their headsets and clipboards, whispered excitedly behind the scenes. After all, this wasn't just any guest. This was Chris Pratt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer and his signature easy grin, Chris walked confidently onto the set, his sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. George Stephanopoulos rose from his chair to greet him, extending his hand with that practiced broadcaster smile. "Chris, welcome," George said smoothly. "Thanks for joining us this morning." "Of course," Chris replied, settling into his chair with that familiar Parks and Recreation charm. "Always happy to be here, George." From the wings, publicist Eli Turner watched with satisfaction, adjusting his expensive tie. This was going exactly as planned, a feel-good segment to promote Chris's new charity-driven film about wildlife conservation. Senior producer Kara Jennings checked her clipboard, noting the relaxed energy in the studio. George adjusted his tie and shuffled his note cards. There was something in his expression that suggested he was preparing for more than the standard celebrity puff piece, but Chris didn't notice. He was too busy cracking jokes with the crew. "So, Chris," George began, leaning slightly forward with his trademark journalistic intensity, "you're here to talk about your new film, which focuses on environmental conservation and giving back. You've spoken a lot about how your faith guides your charitable work, but I have to ask, given some of the controversies surrounding Hillsong Church and its leadership, do you feel any responsibility to address those concerns publicly?" The studio audience let out a faint murmur at the unexpectedly pointed question. Chris's perfectly practiced smile flickered for just a moment, like a TV signal briefly interrupted. He let out a short laugh, clearly caught off guard. "Well," he said, his voice maintaining its usual warmth, but with a slight edge of caution, "I think people who spend their time reading headlines and gossip columns love to create controversies where none exist. My faith is personal, George. It's between me and God, not between me and Twitter." George didn't flinch, but he gave a faint nod, clearly prepared for this deflection. "That's interesting," he replied calmly, jotting something on his notepad. "But when you're as public as you are about your beliefs, posting scripture, talking about God's plan for your career, don't you think that invites scrutiny? Some would say you can't have it both ways." Chris's smile hardened slightly, though he maintained his composure. "I've never hidden who I am," he said, sitting back and crossing his arms. "I'm a man of faith, and I'm proud of that. If that makes some people uncomfortable, that's really not my problem." Offstage, Eli shifted nervously, his phone already buzzing with texts from the studio's PR team. This wasn't the lighthearted promotion they'd planned. Kara spoke quietly into her headset, debating whether to signal George to pivot back to the film. George kept his eyes locked on Chris's. "But it's not just about comfort, is it? It's about consistency." "Let's talk about that consistency for a moment," George continued, his tone remaining measured but carrying a sharper edge. "You've positioned yourself as Hollywood's wholesome family man, the guy who thanks God at award shows, posts about his workout routines, and shares sweet messages about his wife and kids. But some of your past interviews tell a different story. Comments about liberal Hollywood, jokes that many found offensive, political statements you later walked back. Do you think there's a disconnect between Chris Pratt, the brand, and Chris Pratt, the person? Chris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He tried to redirect with a laugh, but it came out forced. George, I came here to talk about a film that's trying to make a difference for endangered species. Can we maybe focus on that instead of relitigating every joke I've ever made? We'll get to the film, George replied smoothly, not missing a beat. But your audience, the people who pay to see your movies, they deserve to know who they're supporting, don't they? You've built your career on being relatable, authentic. So when people point out contradictions, isn't that fair game? The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing the tension crackling between the two men. Chris leaned forward, his easygoing demeanor beginning to crack. Contradictions, he said, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm.
From her position behind the cameras, Kara caught Eli's eye. The publicist was now pacing, his face pale, already drafting damage control statements on his phone. She spoke quietly into her headset. "Do we cut to commercial?" George's expression remained neutral, but there was steel in his voice. "Growth is admirable, Chris, but when that growth coincides perfectly with career advancement, some might call that calculating rather than spiritual." For the first time, Chris's smile disappeared entirely. "And what about your career, George?" he shot back, his tone sharper now. "Weren't you one of Clinton's guys before this? Tell me about the contradictions there, spinning for politicians one day, claiming to seek truth the next." The comment was clearly meant to sting, and for the first time, George's composed expression flickered. The battle lines were now drawn, and both men knew there was no going back to pleasant morning television chatter. The tension in the studio was now thick enough to cut with a knife. George absorbed Chris's jab about his political past with the practiced composure of a man who'd weathered far worse storms. He set his cards down entirely, his eyes never leaving Chris's face. "Fair enough," George said evenly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Let's talk about authenticity then. You've built your entire brand on being the genuine, down-to-earth guy, the reformed slacker from Parks and Rec who found God and got his act together. But isn't that just another performance? Another role you're playing for the cameras?" Chris laughed, but it was sharp now, almost mocking. "Oh, here we go," he said, shaking his head. "The classic journalist move. If you can't attack the message, attack the messenger. You want to know what's authentic, George? This is authentic. Me sitting here wondering why you invited me on your show just to tear me down." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some loyal Chris Pratt fans began to murmur disapproval at George's line of questioning, while others leaned forward, captivated by the rare sight of their beloved Star-Lord dropping his affable mask. George didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to tear you down, Chris. I'm trying to understand the disconnect between the man who preaches humility and the man who can't seem to handle a few tough questions without getting defensive." "Defensive?" Chris shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Or maybe I'm just tired of journalists like you who think asking loaded questions makes you some kind of truth seeker. You want the real Chris Pratt? Here he is. I don't owe you or anyone else a performance of vulnerability just to satisfy your narrative." Behind the cameras, Kara spoke urgently into her headset. "Ratings are spiking. Do we let this play out?" The answer from the control room was immediate. "Keep rolling." Eli stopped pacing entirely, his face now a mask of barely controlled panic as he watched his client's carefully constructed image crumble in real time. George leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's dig into that a little deeper," he said with surgical precision. "You mentioned preaching humility, and that brings me back to your faith. You've said repeatedly that God opened doors for your career, that your success is part of his plan, but you've also been very strategic about which doors you've walked through. The Marvel movies, the Jurassic franchise, these aren't exactly missionary work. Do you ever feel like you use faith as both shield and spotlight? protection from criticism when it's convenient, and positive press when you need it? The question hit Chris like a slap. His entire body went rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. Are you seriously questioning my faith right now? On live television? You want to sit there and imply that my relationship with God is some kind of PR strategy? I'm asking legitimate questions about a public figure who makes his beliefs very public. You post scripture on Instagram. You thank Jesus at award shows. You've done interviews about how Christianity changed your life. But when pressed about the contradictions, you claim it's personal and off-limits. Which is it, Chris? Chris leaned forward aggressively, pointing a finger at George. You know what this is? This is exactly the kind of anti-religious bias that drives people away from Hollywood. You can't stand that someone in this town actually believes in something bigger than themselves. Anti-religious bias? George's eyebrows rose. Chris, I've interviewed everyone from the Pope to Billy Graham. This isn't about your faith. It's about your consistency. From the wings, Eli was now frantically making cutthroat gestures to Kara, mouthing "end this" repeatedly. But she shook her head, mesmerized by the train wreck unfolding before her. The phones were already ringing off the hook. This was the kind of television that defined careers. My consistency? Chris's voice cracked with indignation. I've been nothing but consistent in my beliefs. George pulled out a tablet, his movements deliberate and calculated. Let's test that consistency, he said, scrolling through what appeared to be research notes. In 2015, you called yourself just a goofball from Minnesota who got lucky. By 2018, after Guardians of the Galaxy, you were talking about God's plan for your career. In 2020, you said your Parks and Rec character.
The blood drained from Chris's face. He hadn't expected George to come this prepared, to have done this much homework. You're cherry-picking quotes from different contexts, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? George pressed. Or are you someone who reinvents himself depending on what's most marketable at the time? The lovable slacker, then the action hero, then the humble Christian, then the serious actor. It's quite an evolution. Chris stood up abruptly, then sat back down, clearly struggling with whether to stay or go. This is unbelievable, he muttered. I come here to promote a charity film, a film about conservation, about giving back, and you want to psychoanalyze my career trajectory? I want to understand why you seem embarrassed by your past, George said quietly. Andy Dwyer made you famous. Parks and Recreation launched your career. But you rarely talk about that show anymore except to distance yourself from it. Do you think comedy is beneath you now? The question struck deep. Chris's jaw worked silently for a moment before he erupted. You want to know why I don't talk about Parks and Rec much? Because every time I do, people like you twist it into some kind of character assassination. That show was amazing. Those people are my family. But God forbid I want to challenge myself as an actor. George's voice remained maddeningly calm. No one's saying you can't challenge yourself, Chris. But there's a difference between growth and denial, between evolution and erasure. The studio was completely silent now, the audience holding their collective breath as they watched one of Hollywood's most beloved stars come apart on the seams on live television. And George Stephanopoulos, with his decades of experience dismantling public figures, was just getting started. George sensed that he had Chris exactly where he wanted him, vulnerable, defensive, and one question away from completely losing control. He leaned forward with the predatory focus of a seasoned interrogator moving in for the kill. Chris, he said, his voice deceptively gentle, let's talk about something you've made very public, your family life. Your marriage to Catherine, your children, the whole grateful husband and father narrative. You post about family dinners, date nights, your kids' milestones. But here's my question. At what point did your personal life become part of your brand? When did Chris Pratt, the father and husband, become Chris Pratt, the product? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Chris's face went completely white, then flushed red with rage. His hands clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. That is completely out of line, he he said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "My family is off limits, period. End of discussion." George's expression remained maddeningly calm. "But Chris, you're the one who put them in the discussion. The Instagram posts, the interviews about fatherhood, the red carpet appearances. You've commodified your private life more than almost any actor I can think of. I'm simply asking if that was a conscious choice." "Commodified?" Chris's voice cracked with indignation. "I share moments of joy with people who support my work. That's called being grateful, not calculating." "Is it, though?" George pressed, consulting his notes again. "Because your social media engagement spikes dramatically whenever you post family content. Your approval ratings in audience surveys improve when you talk about being a dad. That sounds like brand management to me." Chris shot to his feet, then immediately sat back down, his internal struggle visible to millions of viewers. "This is disgusting," he muttered. "Absolutely disgusting." George's voice remained steady as a surgeon's blade. "The truth often is uncomfortable, Chris." One last question, and the phrase itself seemed to electrify the studio air. Everyone, from Kara behind the cameras to the stunned audience members, sensed this was the moment that would define everything that came after. Chris's eyes narrowed, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Make it count," he said through gritted teeth. George smiled, that thin, professional smile that had intimidated politicians and celebrities for decades. "You've spent this entire interview positioning yourself as the victim of media bias, victim of anti-religious sentiment, victim of unfair questions. But isn't that itself a performance? The wounded nice guy who's just trying to do good in a cruel world. How long have you been practicing that particular role?" The words hit Chris like a physical blow. For a moment he sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then something inside him simply snapped. "You know what?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "This interview is over." He reached up and yanked off his microphone, the small device hitting the coffee table between them with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent studio. The sound seemed to break some kind of spell. Suddenly everyone was moving at once. "Chris, please," George began, but Chris was already standing, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. From the wings, Eli finally broke free from his paralysis and rushed toward the set, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. "Chris, let's just—" But Chris was already walking away, his sneakers squeaking against the studio floor with each angry step. The cameras followed him, capturing every moment of his retreat, every expression of hurt and rage that crossed his face. George remained seated, watching Chris's exit with the detached interest of a scientist observing a successful experiment. George turned back to the cameras with the smooth professionalism that had made him a household name. The studio remained eerily quiet. Even the crew seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. He straightened his tie, shuffled his notes, and looked directly into the lens with the steady gaze of a man who knew exactly what he'd just accomplished. "Well," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of what might have been satisfaction, "that's not how we planned to end this segment, but perhaps it's the most honest moment we've seen from Chris Pratt in years." He paused, letting the words sink in for the millions of viewers who were undoubtedly rewinding and screenshotting and texting their friends about what they'd just witnessed. When we invite public figures onto this show, we have a responsibility, not just to promote their projects, but to ask the questions that matter, to push past the prepared talking points and the carefully crafted personas. Because the truth is, when someone builds their career on authenticity, on being real, then authenticity becomes fair game for examination. Behind the cameras, Kara was fielding calls from network executives, her phone buzzing incessantly. Social media was already exploding. Hashtag Chris Pratt walkout was trending, split between those defending the actor and those praising George's journalistic integrity. Some will say I was too hard on Chris Pratt, that I crossed lines, that I was unfair. But journalism isn't about being fair, it's about being truthful. And sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes them angry. Sometimes it makes them walk away. He glanced toward the wings where Chris had disappeared, then back to the camera. The question isn't whether my questions were comfortable. It's whether they were necessary. Whether the public has a right to understand the difference between the person they're asked to admire and the carefully constructed image they're sold. George's voice carried the weight of decades in television, the authority of someone who had seen politicians crumble and celebrities crack under pressure. We'll be right back after this commercial break. The chaos erupted the moment the camera stopped rolling. Outside the ABC studios, a growing crowd of paparazzi had already assembled, their telephoto lenses trained on every exit like predators waiting for wounded prey. Inside, the aftermath was just as frenzied. Chris stormed through the backstage corridors, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, with Eli scrambling to keep pace beside him. "Chris, we need to talk about damage control," the publicist panted, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from every major entertainment outlet. "TMZ is already running clips. We need a statement. We need—" Chris snapped without slowing his stride. As they pushed through the building's rear exit, a wall of camera flashes exploded like lightning. Photographers shouted questions over each other. "Chris, do you regret walking out? Was George out of line? Will you respond to his closing comments?" Chris shoved past them without a word, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. The images, his flushed face, his angry stride, his refusal to engage, would be on every gossip site within the hour. Meanwhile, back in the studio, George sat in his dressing room reviewing footage on his laptop, his expression unreadable. Kara knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her face a mixture of exhilaration and concern. Networks thrilled with the ratings spike, but they're getting pushback. Chris's fans are calling it an ambush. Hashtag Justice for Pratt is trending alongside hashtag Chris Pratt walkout. George closed the laptop and looked at her with the calm of someone who'd weathered far worse storms. Good journalism makes people uncomfortable. That's how you know it matters. Within hours, the internet was ablaze with hot takes, think pieces, and viral memes. Some praised George's unflinching pursuit of truth. Others condemned him for destroying a beloved figure. Chris Pratt's name dominated trending topics, but for the first time in years, not because of a movie trailer or a cute family photo. The mask had slipped, and millions had seen what lay beneath. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.